Hello, and welcome to this London Climate Action Week event and the sixth discussion in the Sustainability First series, Together for a Fair Climate Future. This series considers the relationship between the climate crisis and fairness in society. So far, we've looked at visions for a more sustainable future, what we value in society, how we can live more sustainably, and how we can tackle the unequal impacts of climate change and the role of technology. Today, we're thinking about leadership for climate change, including on climate issues. We want to learn from those who've led positive change in a variety of ways and how to ensure that leadership leads to action at the scale and pace needed to respond to the climate emergency. Across the discussion series, we've heard from young activists, artists, policymakers, community organisers, business leaders, and people who've been impacted by climate change already. They've shared their experiences, expertise, and recommendations. Before we begin today, we'd like to reflect on some of the themes that have emerged from the discussions so far to help frame our debate today. We've heard that climate change is a social issue as well as an environmental issue. We've heard that it's unfairly impacting some people and individuals more than others. We've heard that decision makers need to engage citizens from diverse backgrounds and diverse communities, including those who've already experienced climate impacts, to inform our UK response. We've heard that local leaders need to be adequately resourced to make the changes needed in their areas. Our events have discussed how businesses have a responsibility to contribute to society and ensure that their practices are just and environmentally sustainable. And we've heard decision makers and businesses need to ensure that sustainable choices are easy and accessible for everyone. Recognising that action by individuals and communities is part of the wider systems change that we need to see. And last but not least, we've heard that art and creativity can help us imagine alternative futures, to innovate, to communicate, and to mobilise action, engaging hearts as well as mind in arguments that go beyond the scientific and the technical. This series of events is going to feed into the United Nations International Climate Change Conference. We're grateful to National Grid, who are supporting this work as one of the COP26 principal partners. Duncan Burt, COP26 Director at National Grid, will be chairing the discussion today. Today's event is streaming live to YouTube. Please do share your questions and comments in the chat. My colleague Sonia will be joining you in the YouTube discussion, and she'll feed some of your questions into the event today. Please be aware that the panel can't see the YouTube chat directly, as we're live streaming from Zoom. Some of our video contributors today will also be on the chat, and the event has captions. We'll also be tweeting about it, so please do join in with the hashtag #FairClimateFuture. So let's meet our wonderful panel. Please could you each introduce yourselves and say something about your work and how you got to where you are today. Duncan, let's start with you.
Thanks, Sharon. And hello to everyone watching this today. My name is Duncan Burt. I'm the COP26 Director for National Grid, and we are a principal partner for COP26, so partnering and supporting the UK government's organisation and work to deliver the COP26 conference. And as part of that, we are incredibly proud to be sponsoring today's event and the series of talks. I'm really interested in what everyone has to say. I'll pass on to Stephen.
Hi there, my name's Stephen Bennett. I'm a visual artist, and I'm interested in particularly in the links between art, science and policymaking. I'm also a policymaker who's worked in government for over 15 years now, and I've spent most of that time working on scientific issues and the interface between science and policy. More recently, I've become the co-head of the Policy Lab, which is a team whose mission is to radically improve policymaking by bringing together design, innovation and people-centered approaches. So really interested in the confluence of art, policy, science and climate. I'm hoping to talk to you more about that today.
Thanks, Stephen. Mya-Rose.
Yeah, my name's Mya-Rose. I'm 19 and I've been very involved in the environmental movement and the climate change movement for quite a few years now. I have an organisation, a charity called Black to Nature, that is all about, I suppose, encouraging diversity within environmental spaces, but also on a very grassroots level. We spend a lot of time getting kids from ethnic minority backgrounds out into nature in the countryside. And I've also been very involved in the youth movement in terms of climate change. Yeah, and I think the conversation is going to be very interesting today.
Thanks, Mya-Rose. Afsheen, what about you?
Hello, everyone. I'm Afsheen Rashid. I'm a community energy specialist. So that brings together my interest around energy and the environment, but really about bringing people with us. So that is what community energy is about. Our vision at Repowering, which is the organization that I'm a co-founder of and the chief exec of, is about creating a fairer, cleaner, energy system that empowers people and communities. So putting people back in the heart of the energy system, but also they have the power, the control, and the management of it, and benefit from what the energy revolution has to bring. And totally, my interest is also about that environmental justice movement as well. So making sure that no one is left behind, so as you were saying, Sharon, as well as Stephen, that the change that we're seeing coming up to a net zero is going to be very, very disruptive. And we need to make sure that everyone is able to participate and benefit from it as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Charlie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces. My name is Charlie Ogilvie. I'm the Director of Strategy for the COP unit, which is the civil service unit within the Cabinet Office, currently coordinating the UK's presidency and running the COP26 conference, which will be in November in Glasgow, supported by National Grid and other fantastic principal partners, but also by a wide network of organisations and other government departments who are helping us put this event together. I've been working in the climate space for about 15 years, both in think tank policy world. I ran a small energy development business. I've worked with community energy projects and campaigning organisations. So it's fascinating to be seeing this problem now from within government, and not only within government, but also within the kind of multilateral system, where some of these problems look very different to viewing them on the ground. So fascinated to be part of this discussion and keen to link things back to what we're trying to achieve at the end of this year at COP26. Thank you.
That's fantastic, and welcome to you all. We're also joined by artist William Bock. William, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone.
And William will be capturing the discussion with as a visual scribe today through his drawings and capturing key words. So we'll go back to that later on today. I'm Sharon Darcy, and I'm the Director of Sustainability First. We're a think tank and a charity which focuses on promoting economic, social and environmental well-being. It's great to have you all here, and I'm now going to hand over to Duncan to take us through the event. Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you, Sarah. So this year, the UK is hosting the UN International Climate Change Conference, COP26, as Charlie said, which is bringing focus to one of the biggest challenges that we face globally, giving an opportunity to identify the actions needed now to build a more resilient and sustainable future. We all play a role in this, and every voice matters in the fight against climate change. As a business, National Grid has a duty to contribute to society, changing the ways we work and operate to curb harmful emissions, protect the environment, and support the communities we work with and work for. Today, we'll be discussing with the panel different forms of leadership, taking inspiration from examples of initiatives by individuals, communities, business and policymakers, learning from their approaches and discussing what it takes to lead positive change. Moving beyond a traditional idea of singular leaders to consider the power of collective action for systems change. Today's discussion will be in two parts. First, we will explore some of the examples of leadership. And secondly, we'll consider leadership skills for future change makers, many of whom I hope we have watching today. We'll introduce each section with some videos to help shape our discussion. So in this first section, we'll hear videos of how people, communities, and organizations have led positive change for the society and environment. We can play the first set of videos, please.
Hi, I am Ishaa and I am a youth activist. I'm a co-founder of Youth Strike for Manchester, an environmental agency, youth advisor and a digital striker with Fridays for Future. I've been asked to talk about young people and the need for us to become empowered as future leaders. This is so important because young people have been instrumental in bringing the climate crisis to the forefront of society's mind. Greta Thunberg, myself, other young strikers all over the world are doing amazing things every day to help the crisis. For example, as Youth MP, I delivered a speech to the Manchester City Council asking for a 2038 carbon neutral target. This motion was passed successfully. Phenomenal things like that are happening every day, and it wouldn't be possible without the support that we have. Young people need to be empowered so they can do things like this. We wouldn't be able to campaign to push for these things and thrive as adults and as future leaders. We will be the leaders of tomorrow, so please invest in us and please listen to what we say.
Hi, I'm Polly Billington and I'm the director of UK 100, the only network for highly ambitious UK locally elected leaders committed to action on climate, clean energy and clean air. Local authorities have been acting on climate locally and bringing the UK closer to net zero emissions set by the government for 2050. Many of the actions required to meet net zero will be made by local councils, so their active involvement is central, ensuring the economic, social and health benefits come to their communities. Almost 60 local leaders have already pledged to lead their communities to net zero with utmost energy and resolve before 2050. They have been a shining light, particularly in key areas such as housing and transport, despite their budgets being slashed. While local councils have been leading the way, they need more powers and resources, clarity over their role, and investment in skills and jobs to take the next step. They are the partners for delivery the national government needs.
Hi, I'm Daniel Johns from Anglian Water. When you think about your local water company, you probably don't think too much beyond whether this is going to work when you need it in the morning, and perhaps even this. But behind the scenes, there's a quiet revolution going on. That's because in April 2019, all water companies in England signed a public interest commitment. Foremost amongst the 5 pledges that water companies had made was as a sector to become net zero in terms of their operational greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. The public interest commitment also committed all water companies in England to champion measures through which water companies can enshrine what it means to operate in the public interest within their business purpose. And Anglian Water was the first company to go ahead and do exactly that. In summer 2019, our owners unanimously agreed to change our Articles of Association to embed a statement of purpose, which is about building the social and environmental prosperity in the east of England, in the region we serve. So in the future, I hope you hear more about your local water company investing in solar and energy storage, using nature-based solutions to protect rivers and prevent local flooding, and acting in the public interest, not least to achieve net zero by 2030.
I'm Gudrun Cartwright, Climate Action Director at Business in the Community. I'm here to talk a little bit about business leadership and the 3 actions we've identified that businesses can take to play a leadership role in driving a transition to a net zero, resilient future that works for people and nature. So the first is to assess the risks and opportunities of the climate crisis and think about how they embed those in their core strategy. The second is to set an ambitious net zero carbon target as close to 2030 as possible and aligned to the Race to Zero campaign if they can. And the third is to make sure that these strategies and plans are developed in collaboration with diverse stakeholders from across their employees, their supply chains, their customers, and the communities in which they operate, to make sure that they are meeting real world concerns and that they are making sure that what they do creates positive outcomes for people and for nature.
I heard about the UK Student Climate Network through Scala and what they were doing, and I realised that I needed to translate all the thoughts and the fears that I had about what's happening to our environment into action, and I decided to get involved in whatever way I could.
Well, obviously UKSCN has been the group that's been driving this in the UK, following sort of Greta's lead from Sweden and around the world. And that's been such an impressive movement, I think, to sort of see young people going into meetings, people my age, like I'm going in as if we're adults, because this is our job, this is what we have to do. You have to work so you can survive. And that's basically what we're doing.
I want to break the cycle of inaction on the climate dialogue in this country, and I want to do that by stopping excluding young people from the conversation.
As a group, I think we're so strong and so determined to make change, but we're also just a platform. We're just a platform for people, for other kids to step up and go, yeah, I will do this, I will change things, I will go on strike, I will speak to my MP, I will speak to my head teacher about changing the curriculum, about teaching younger students. And I just think that's been so amazing.
Fantastic. Those videos are almost an exhausting sweep across so many different forms of leadership in the landscape of climate change at the moment. Mya-Rose, perhaps I can just start with you. Just reflecting on the comments on those videos, how does that speak to your own personal experience, and how have you found leadership in climate change?
I think because I've been interested and involved in climate change activism for maybe 6+ years now. And I remember one of the most exciting moments as a climate activist was when Greta Thunberg did pop up seemingly out of nowhere and managed to inspire, you know, hundreds of thousands of kids and teenagers around the world to take action. And I think that is what true leadership is, being able to inspire people to try and create change. And I think people almost underestimate the power that moment had on the entire climate change conversation, where it went from being a very niche, almost extremist topic, especially in political spaces, to being absolutely mainstream. So I absolutely wouldn't ever underestimate the power of youth movements, especially in the climate change space. And I think, you know, there's so much more that's going to happen going forward. I think it's really exciting.
I mean, even in probably my relatively fusty corporate world, Greta was transformative in terms of the way that opened the dialogue. Stephen, is that something that you recognise and something that also gave you a boost in the same way it did for Mya-Rose?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I guess a few of us on this call have a bit of the longer view, having been in government or worked in policy making for a longer term. I remember actually in the late 2010s, I think, which was when the Climate Change Act occurred. And there was actually quite a lot of momentum behind that at that point, and it almost came a quite cross-party consensus piece. And there seems to be quite a lot of progress there. But I definitely think in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been another boost, and it's been a much needed boost. So I think it's, you know, it seems like you have these moments and you need to take advantage of these moments, and then you can catalyze quite a lot of action in those moments, and then you know, things will die down again, and then you need another push a bit later.
And Afsheen, does that vibe for you? I can see Mya-Rose nodding there. Afsheen, does that? I'm not going to say any of us are long in the tooth. I beat you all into a cocked hat on age, I'm sure. But does that feel familiar to you?
Yes. I think I've also had a level of skepticism previously when there was this, you know, all of a sudden this shift in focus onto, you know, climate change, and kind of thinking, oh, will this just kind of fade away like it has in the past? Will it really last and you know, stick with people in terms of their behaviors? So it's been good and refreshing to see that it is lasting and that people are taking it seriously. It feels a bit different to previous times when, you know, there've been commitments and then all of a sudden it just gets watered down over the years. But now seeing, you know, the targets, ambitions, and, you know, local authorities across, you know, signing to their, not just making their declarations, but also making their action plans. So yeah, I'm feeling positive about it, and I'm glad that you know, this is definitely in the public discourse. There is more engagement, and it's no longer seen as, you know, this niche group of people who are working on this, you know, these charity group, you know, organizations, or, you know, have you, you know, there's this image of of these people tree hugging or whatever, you know, and it's shifted. That has shifted into more public domain, and I find it refreshing when my friends and family who live, you know, in India and other parts of the world say, "Oh, you know, Afsheen, this thing that you've been working on all these years, you know, now we know what it means." And so for me, that's like, okay, you know, like, it's not just me amongst my friends and my natural kind of environmental bubble, but it's people who aren't in that bubble who are also thinking about their behavior and drawing the dots. So I'm positive.
And as you say, I'm going to come to Charlie to give us the sort of broad international perspective from the top. But has that, Afsheen, for you, has that changed your role and how you've had to lead? Because as you say, I guess to a certain extent, it's gone from having to push and advocacy into one where you've got lots of people turning up wondering what they've just committed to at a local council or local level. Is that fair?
I think we've had to push for a long time. So you know, at Repowering, we work in partnership with local authorities, and it has, you know, it's been a bit of a, you know, balance where you need to work in collaboration, and you know, they have a huge role to play, and it's been leaders within the councils, you know, political domain, who really understood community energy and understood that power and needs to be given back to the people, and they, you know, they're driving the agenda, and working with organizations like us, kind of bringing people along with us, because the challenge is also when we go out door knocking on people's doors. And in the past, I've never spoken about climate change when I'm knocking on the door, you know, of a resident on a social housing estate. That's not been the message. The message has been, how are we going to help you save money on your energy bills? How are we going to help you live in warm, comfortable homes? Climate change wasn't part of the discourse and the discussion, but it's been interesting to see now, like, you know, our volunteers who are joining the energy co-ops that we establish are motivated by wanting to take action on climate change. People are investing in schemes, putting their money into these schemes because they want to do something in their local neighborhood, and they want to be also doing their bit to tackle climate change. So I feel that's, you know, we've been playing a role, not just bringing communities and individuals on board, but there's also been like, you know, bringing the local authorities and showing them there is a different way, and bringing people into it as well.
And Charlie, we've heard you know, that discussion is how things have moved outside of a climate change bubble, and very much that now, that boil up from the grassroots and from local communities, really starting to see climate change as the driver for action rather than a secondary consideration. Does that give you confidence in the top level? How do you see leadership moving into COP26 for the UK, and what's going well at an international level or not going well?
Thanks, Duncan. I mean, it's fascinating, and picking up on Stephen's point that, you know, a lot of these issues and voices have been active in the climate space for a long time. You know, the UNFCCC itself, the treaty enshrines observer organisations, making sure that youth voices from across the gender spectrum, from NGOs, from trade unions, etc., are part of the process at the COP. So, you know, for decades, the climate conversation has tried to facilitate leadership from a really diverse and inclusive range of parts of the kind of global challenge. And it has been fascinating, though, quite how the wider public has woken up over the last 5 years to this particular problem. And I think the voice of youth has been hugely catalytic in that. And you can talk about correlation and causation, but the Fridays for Future movement and the strikes and the run into the UK adopting its net zero target, which at the time was way ahead of most other major developed countries, and the power of that youth voice in playing back leadership to the grown-ups in the room was really quite striking. But it's worth saying, there's been youth leadership on climate from across the globe, and there are fantastic networks of youth climate leaders that existed, prior to Greta. And I think what's happened is that as society's been ready for that leadership, and then leaders from youth voices and elsewhere have catalyzed that moment, and that leadership can accelerate outcomes, and it can catalyze a broader conversation and a stronger signal of the kind of political will. So it's really exciting to be trying to solve this problem now with such an extraordinary amount of kind of political energy behind the solution. How much does that play into the room in Glasgow? I mean, to an enormous extent. As I said at the start of my comments, these groups are wired into the process, and part of our presidency strategy is to make sure that those delegates sitting in dry rooms in Glasgow pondering complex bits of technical text can hear, quite literally the expectations of civil society when they are trying to reach those conclusions. And we're playing that into the technical discussions and the politics of the building. So I'm optimistic because there is a huge amount of energy and some fantastic leadership. Of course, this is a huge and complex problem to solve, and I wouldn't be a good civil servant without caveating the immense challenges of what we have to deliver in the next 5 months.
Brilliant, thanks, Charlie. And Mya-Rose, coming back to you, that discussion of, I think everyone said it, and I would absolutely agree with it, the focus that has come and the transformative thing that has come from School Strike for Climate and Fridays for Future, and the challenge of youth protest through this has been, I think, enormously important. As Afsheen said, things are beginning to have moved rapidly outside of a climate change bubble to be more mainstream. Well, certainly it probably feels like that to all of us in the climate bubble. Do you think that still needs bursting? When you look at the next 2 or 3 years, what are you really thinking about your message being, and how you'll need to show leadership through that?
Yes, I absolutely think it needs bursting. But just quickly as well on the last point, I think in a conversation about leadership, it's really important to remember that our world leaders are not showing leadership when it comes to climate change, and that we have been consistently let down, even by the recent G7 conversations in terms of climate change. So I think in some ways, in terms of that climate change bubble, it's easy to feel like people are maybe really listening more than they actually are. And I think as well, when there are lots and lots of conversations about these issues happening, it's really important that we expect action, not more conversation. But in terms of the climate change bubble, I think it is still incredibly, in the West at least, incredibly middle class, incredibly white. And I think that there is a real failure to engage with people, because a lot of the time, when I talk to people who aren't engaged with these issues, a lot of people are very busy literally just trying to survive day to day, going to their job, putting food on the table, getting their kids to school, and they feel like they don't have the time or the energy to get involved or to even care about these issues because they are busy. And so a lot of these environmental issues end up being seen as a very middle class pursuit when they shouldn't be at all. And I think the thing that we really need to highlight in these conversations is that people who are very wealthy, people who are very upper class, aren't going to be the ones who are going to experience the effects of issues like climate change when we start getting more heat waves in the UK, when we start getting more flooding. It's going to be people who don't have the money or the resources to deal with these issues who suffer. And so I think what we really need to do is readjust that conversation and help people understand why this is an issue now that they kind of need to care about, or at least needs to influence their vote. I think as well, in a lot of Western countries, there is a failure to diversify. Like I said before, it's incredibly white. And again, I think it's a failure of communication, because whenever I do sit down and talk to people from various communities, I quite often talk to them about countries where their family's from and things like that. So for example, I have family in Bangladesh, and just making the link for people, talking about how you know, the drought and the flooding and the loss of crop is all connected to climate change, again, makes it incredibly real and close for people. So I think, yeah, there is still so much that needs to be done in terms of engaging with people, in terms of outreach. But I think it's definitely possible. We just need to think about how we're communicating on these issues.
Thanks, Laura. It's fascinating. Hey, Stephen, there's still a lot of talk, but the action still needs to come, as Mya-Rose says, and that need to influence outside of bubbles and to make it a whole societal challenge. As an artist looking at this, do you see those issues? Do you feel you found ways to stretch across those boundaries?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the things I always enjoy doing is looking in different disciplines and understanding what lessons we can learn from that discipline to apply into the climate space. And I think, you know, artists and artists, the arts world and artists bring quite a lot of potential strategies which are quite useful here. So if you think about decision making, you know, why do people make decisions? There's often a range of factors in that. Some might be the evidence, but some things might be more emotional qualities or considerations or people's experiences. People might have gone through an experience of something. And actually, I think artists have quite a lot of abilities and tactics that they can use to bring out some of these qualities. So I think artists are often quite good at, you know, if you think about things like the Scream or some of Van Gogh's work, you know, these are emotional pieces. They make you kind of feel something, but it doesn't need to be paintings in an art gallery. It could also be TV programs, films. You know, climate change has been incredibly well portrayed in films, you know, in quite kind of different ways. I really like Mad Max and the kind of the worlds, the dystopian worlds that are created in some of those films historically or more recently. So yeah, I think the arts can play quite an important role here, thinking about bringing to life issues, visualizing issues, and really kind of tugging on some of those emotional components of the decision-making process.
Yeah, fascinating. And Afsheen, I think, you know, I really agree with Mya-Rose there. We still need to see the action, don't we? And there is this real threat that the climate change conversation, at least, is still heavily middle class, heavily dominated by people engaged in the policy or those that have the time to engage in it in their daily lived experience. Is that something you absolutely still challenge with you? And you know, how are you thinking about that in terms of community action?
Yeah, no, that's something that's been very much part of what I do in terms of trying to be as inclusive. So at Repowering, you know, when we started our first project in Brixton, there wasn't a project that happened in an inner city community, you know, that was community owned solar project, because it was seen as something, community energy projects or cooperatives were seen as something people who had money, white middle class communities in rural parts of England, and it couldn't happen in a place like Brixton. And by showing that we were able to deliver a community-owned solar power station, the first of its kind, on a Brixton housing estate, really showed that if you really tried, then you could make things happen differently. And it only was possible by that inclusive model of engagement, by, you know, going the extra mile to make sure that you're doing your engagement and reaching out to the diverse communities and voices that are local to that area. We've been building on that model more recently as well, and we've been recruiting local champions. So each of our co-ops will have local champions who are locally rooted, represent that community, and are able to then network amongst their peers and their networks, because those networks exist. You know, communities organize not just around the environment, they organize around their local issues and context, and they're there and present. You know, those diverse voices are very much present in the community. It's about going about your engagement and reaching out and connecting and with those individuals to bring their voice and include them in the dialogue and the debate. And I totally agree with you know, Maya's point around people are literally trying to make ends meet, put food on the table, warm their homes. And it's really about bringing them on board and showing them how the change or new technologies or adoption of new ways can help them improve their life or help them in their journeys moving forward. So a lot of what we do around tackling fuel poverty, particularly over last year, we've seen that it's really been hard. People have been really let down by institutes and by the system. I've found that communities, and I think many of us know how community organizations have really stepped in to that space to support those vulnerable and those hardly heard groups. So I think if we're thinking about whole system change, we also need to think about how we collaborate and bring in all the different players and key stakeholders in the local area. So local authorities have a strong role to play, businesses have a role to play, but equally the community business sector and the voluntary sector have a very strong role to play, and we all need to play our part in terms of making sure that no one is left behind and that everyone benefits equally from the changes.
Afsheen, I'm nodding away furiously, Afsheen. I'm going to beat Charlie and just answer the question. We're going to talk about business there as well, because as you say, all of civil society and business it seems to me, has a big role to play in both calling out the change that's needed, taking the first step where we can, and also trying to make it simple for people. As Stephen said at the beginning, it's incredibly complex, and we have to break this down into simple, navigable chunks for people to really understand what's going on in order to enable that change. You can't ask people to spend hours and days understanding this, but we can engage with TV, with media, in starting to embed this into the national consciousness as to what needs to be done. Certainly in the UK and the US, that's a lot of the work we're trying to do. Sonia, I'm going to come to you for any questions on the YouTube chat in a minute, but Charlie, just before we go there, that theme as to, that this is a middle class problem really in terms of how the debate goes at a UK level. You're exposed to that global conversation as well. How do you see the UK providing that leadership and making those trade-offs between, what is on the one hand historically a heavy polluting set of wealthier nations and the need for global consensus in order to get to net zero by 2050?
Thanks, Duncan. It's a big question. A huge amount to agree with from the previous comments. And look, the specific centre of where the climate conversation happens in different countries varies massively across the world. And some countries, the political debate is very much driven from a grassroots level. Others, it suffers similarly from being a somewhat kind of middle class discussion, as arguably we have had in the UK. UK leadership, I think. The presidency role is hugely challenging. You're overseeing negotiations, and a lot of that involves creating neutral space for parties to find solutions. But in a funny way, the leadership question is quite easy when it comes to talking about what the COP needs to deliver, because the science is so utterly stark. This is the last time this process can deliver us the 1.5 degree pathway. And we know from the science that exceeding that 1.5 has some incredibly catastrophic consequences potentially for communities across the world, including many communities here in the UK. So we have a very clear mission here to keep the pathway to 1.5 degrees alive, and actually that gives us a very clear platform. In terms of how that plays out in the COP, this is a process which really has some big tests of trust at the heart of it between the global south and the developed economies, notably around climate finance, where we have to show that we can deliver the 100 billion that was committed in Copenhagen. Otherwise, quite rightly, a lot of countries are going to turn up to play at the COP saying, this process has really not been entered into in the spirit that we all signed up to at the start. So why should we play ball driving for higher ambition outcomes? So, I think the leadership is implicit in the mission. And of course, there's a huge amount of nuance in how that plays out in the way that we engage with lots of different countries around the world. But I suppose in conclusion, right now we're sitting here enjoying a balmy June afternoon in Jacobabad. The temperature is 52 degrees and there's hundreds of thousands of people who are literally suffering in temperatures that the human body can't healthily exist in. this problem is upon us now, and arguably we've spent the last 2 decades doing too much talking and not enough action. And I think, Mya-Rose's call to action is absolutely right. This is, somebody said to me the other day, diversity and inclusion aren't the same thing. You can have a diverse range of people in the room. That doesn't mean all those voices are included. But also inclusivity is not the same as action. And you have to be listening to those voices, not just to capture it on a piece of paper, but to capture it in real actions and push the agenda forward. And I think this COP can only succeed if we manage to hear those voices from those communities most affected, but also accept that the globe has to go through an absolutely unprecedented transformation in the next 10 years if we're going to manage global temperatures. And that's going to take leadership in every bit of society, in every country, and whether it's people generating community energy projects, in the city in the UK, whether that's farmers' leadership taking new technologies to land use practices, whether that's the transformation of energy grids, Duncan, and the work the National Grid is doing. Everyone has to be a leader and everyone has to be taking action, because this is a bit of a last chance saloon, I'm afraid, as far as the science is concerned.
100%, Charlie. Thanks for that. It's a sobering set of stats before we move out of this section. Just before we do, we've just got time, Sonia, to squeeze in a couple of questions from the chat if we've got any coming in. Sonia, you want to come on?
Yeah. So we just have a question from the chat. Actually, someone's asking if the panelists could explain what we're sort of working towards. And basically, he's writing there seems to be a lack of a specific goal that we're working towards in terms of leadership for change. Is it net zero? Is it community-based governance? So what really are we working towards as leaders?
Hey, Charlie and Afsheen, do you want to both tackle that one quickly? Charlie first, just building off, you were stating a lot of that in your COP26 answer.
So I think that, it's a great question. And I think, it's a challenging COP because there's a huge number of things we have to deliver in it. So you can't quite crystallize it out in the way that 5 years ago, we needed a big agreement and we got the Paris Agreement, box tick, job done. This year is really challenging. We have to deliver a package of country commitments and policy commitments that mean we can plausibly say that 1.5 degrees is still possible. And that's hugely challenging. But equally, we already have, 1+ degree of warming baked into the global system. We have to show the global south in particular, but actually every country on earth, that we are adapting and we have plans for adaptation and finance for adaptation, and that communities affected will get the help that they need. And we have to show that we are unlocking on the investment side, both public and private funds in order to deliver that. And finally, I think we have to set up from this COP a legacy of better cooperation and collaboration to deliver on the huge technical challenges that we will need to succeed in if we're going to keep this show on the road. It's not quite as pithy as everybody signed a Paris Agreement, but that's pretty much at a high level what we're trying to achieve at COP26. And whether we achieve it or not, this challenge will continue, and the extremely multifaceted nature of this particular set of problems will be part of the nature of why it's so difficult to mobilize the political economy to act on it.
And Afsheen, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely need the right policies, long-term policies, strategic planning, as Charles has been mentioning, and that investment. So not just the words, and the words on paper, but the money. So show me the money, the investment in the areas that is needed. But from my point of view, we really need to bring people with us, and we need to enable people to be part of this change and to adapt their lifestyles, because what we're going to expect is not just the policy, but we're going to expect people, individuals, to make changes to their lifestyles and their choices. So we as individuals have a big role to play in the success of the direction of travel. So in terms of leadership, where we need people to bring everyone with us on this journey, and we need to be inclusive. So I would say part of that is about empowering people, and it's about creating a cleaner and a fairer future, so that everyone can be part of it and participate and be on this journey and benefit from it.
Brilliant, thank you, Afsheen. Sonia, we'll come back to you a bit later for more questions. We'll try and allow more time in the second section. But really conscious of time, I'm just going to move on to the second section where we look at the skills for future leadership and change makers. So we could play the second set of videos now, please.
Hi, my name is Manuela, and I'm a fellow of Youth Climate Leaders. YCL is a global network created with the mission to tackle two of the main challenges youth face nowadays, the climate crisis and systemic unemployment. We do that by offering learning journeys and professional opportunities that place young people as leaders in the transition to a zero-carbon future. One challenge we face is reaching to those that belong to marginalized minority groups. That's why more than 30% of our fellows have received financial support to undertake our course. We are proud to help making the climate agenda more inclusive and more diverse.
Maxwell Ayamba, the founder and project coordinator of the Sheffield Environmental Movement. With regards to leadership skills, it's important that the person who is the leader has got compassion, empathy, trust, and good relationship and bonding with the groups that he or she works with, to ensure that what kind of positive change that one is trying to get across is done appropriately and with respect. Respect, trust, and understanding working in community groups is quite important. And so these are some of the leadership skills I have been using when I set up SIM in 2016. And I have money to work with diverse community groups in Sheffield, getting them out into countryside to reconnect with the natural environment for health and well-being. And this has led to a sea of change in communities, understanding both the ecological and the cultural history of the British landscape, and being empowered to want to get involved in environmental issues, especially in times of the climate crisis that we are facing as a community of people.
I'm Amisha Patel, and I lead public affairs for Principal Power, a leading technology and service provider for the floating offshore wind energy market. While businesses have been working to address climate change for years now, much of the work has so far consisted of steps to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. To lead positive change, businesses must support society in adapting to climate risk. As we experience the reality of our already changing climate, business leaders must develop skills to support society in a way that addresses inequality and structural inclusion.
This Is a Love Story is a new pop musical telling the 200,000-year love story of Earth and humanity in 14 original pop songs.
As artists, we believe that leadership is found in the stories we choose to tell on our stages. We want to put empathy at the centre of the climate conversation.
We've chosen the metaphor of a romantic relationship to shine a fresh light on the climate crisis and our relationship with the planet.
We're really excited to be presenting 2 songs from the show on Thursday the 1st of July on London Climate Action Week's YouTube channel.
In the performing arts, it's all too easy to feel defeated by ancient buildings, inefficient touring practices, and carbon-heavy production values. At this very early stage, we have the perfect opportunity to embed sustainable practice on the stage as well as off stage, and to engage our partners in that conversation too. I believe our job is not to preach, but to entertain and to engage audiences' emotions, and I can't wait.
I'm Judy Ling Wong, Honorary President of Black Environment Network. In 1987, we challenged the environmental sector by asserting that there is no such thing as a purely environmental project. A so-called purely environmental project is one that has neglected its social, cultural, and economic context. Climate change is impacting on livelihoods, health and well-being, food security, and displacing people through drought, floods, and wildfire. There's now a rising generation of multicultural voices, highly aware of intersectionality and the reality of a global interconnected world. My recommendation for future leaders of change is to push for people-centered policy, leading to actions anchored in the principles of diversity, equality, and inclusion.
Fantastic. Again, it's some really provoking and challenging ways. So I wrote down respect, community, empathy, and engagement there across words on leadership. In terms of skills, you know, the kind of political issues we're dealing with here seem to me that what we're looking for are very different types of leadership that you would normally see measured in a business environment. I'll say measured rather than impactful, because I think actually the ones that really work are probably quite similar. But Afsheen, just starting with you, you've been working in this space for a long time and really building an organisation with a whole set of skills to work right across the community in many of the ways those videos were talking to there. How, when you look at your team, your group, how do those collective skills present opportunities in terms of leadership?
I think leadership, I just wanted to add, is changed so much. It has changed so much. It's not that the singular, alpha male at the top dictating the way things are done. And what I find, the way it's changed in the sense that there is distributed power and there is empowering, and the words empathy and compassion really resonate with me. And what we have in our team is a real caring, nurturing environment. So we all have something to learn from each other. And by empowering the team and them driving and shaping their day-to-day jobs and their agenda, they're shaping and driving the organization forward. So we're all moving with a shared vision of where we want to get to. And each one is empowered in their journeys to get there. And I feel quite privileged or empowered by my team in return as well. They empower me to do what I'm doing as best as I can. So it's, I think that nurturing role is so important. And I feel like as a leader of the organization, my strength is in my softness and my listening and nurturing skills. And I think that's what we then take back into the communities with us that we are working in. And we've just seen such fantastic journeys as a result of that, where individuals who've not had the confidence or skills to chair a meeting or to be in a role of leadership, they've now grown and emerged to strong voices and leaders in their communities. And that's so great to see that, and again, making sure that, they are in control of what's happening in their communities and making that change happen. And just to give an example of what does that mean, because when I remember when we first went to one of the communities in Bannister House, the group there said, "Oh, nothing happens on our estate. This isn't, we're not going to see the solar panels go up on this roof. Never happens." And 2 years on, we had raised £150,000 and we had installed the solar panels on 14 blocks on the estate. And that was their journey, their success, their pride, and they shifted the narrative for their estate. So that, that's the power of that kind of sharing, nurturing, compassion, empathy, empowering communities. That's what that looks like.
Fascinating. And probably, if it's not unfair, almost meeting people where they are, meeting communities where they are, rather than driving them in a particular direction. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so.
Really interesting. Really interesting. Mya-Rose, just building on that, I mean, I think the youth climate movement has not been meeting people where they are, has it? It's been absolutely calling out the need for action. So do you think those types of leadership are similar, or do we need to learn something very different from the youth climate movement?
I think, well, there's so many different types of leadership, and I think
yeah, sure,
is so interesting because it sort of has a figurehead, but very similar to Extinction Rebellion and groups like that in a lot of ways. You've totally just got groups of kids getting together in the areas that they live in and going out protesting. There isn't some big network, it isn't a big pyramid, it's just individual groups. Which I think is really exciting. Like in Europe, where we saw thousands and thousands and thousands of kids going out into the streets, that was literally just from WhatsApp chats, from people adding all of their contact, what they knew, who were under like 25. And that was how they advertised it. And so I think when we're talking about leadership, quite often all you need is a figurehead, which is what Greta Thunberg has been so great at doing. She has literally just gotten people excited and passionate over an issue that people were very concerned about. But I think in some ways Extinction Rebellion, which isn't necessarily a youth group but does have a lot of young people involved, is more interesting when talking about leadership, just because it's very much gone out of its way not to have a leader. That's sort of one of its base rules, really, that there's never a leader, especially within individual groups, and yet it's been so functional and it's pulled in so many members. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is that in some ways it shows that within community projects, within more grassroots projects, you don't necessarily need to have an individual leader. Quite often all you need is a cause for people to be passionate about and to rally together around. And I think climate change is the key example of that, just because, you know, looking at the numbers, looking at the studies, so many people, especially young people, are so concerned about these things. And so really what I think is very important isn't necessarily, you know, finding the best person, the best leader, but empowering people and helping to engage them with an issue in the first place. And like I said earlier, helping them to understand why they should care. But yeah, the youth movement has been very interesting. And I think as people get older and as it gets bigger, it's going to continue to evolve as well, and also utilize the internet more and more, which I won't get into. But I think the internet is absolutely underutilized at the moment when it comes to campaigning and activism. Like, there's so many things we haven't even thought of and haven't even explored. So that's going to be very interesting as well in the years to come.
Stephen, I can see you smiling knowingly at that. Is that something you agree with?
Well, I was just reflecting on such beautiful words from Mya-Rose and from Afsheen there. I mean, I think you guys have just put it so eloquently and so well. Yeah, just fantastic. I think I have this kind of love-hate relationship with the term empowerment. I sort of feel that a couple of the videos talked about the need for empowerment, and I'm sure you guys would agree, but no one needs to wait to be empowered. And I think that's one of the lessons that we've seen from some of the youth movements, some of the schools work, is that people have said, we're not going to wait to be empowered. We're just going, this is too important for it. We're just going to do it. So in some respects, I think that's a really great thing to see and to follow, and that practice. But at the same time, you know, we have to acknowledge that in many ways the world is hierarchical and unequal, and there are power relationships in the world, and people might want to bring those down or to just deconstruct them in various ways. We're living in a system at the moment where there are power relations, and I think I've actually researched and explored some quite interesting leadership models, which you'll be familiar with. So one might be the theatre director. We actually saw a theatre director in one of those videos, but theatre director has a sort of leadership role in the studio, which I think is quite interesting. Also, I was fortunate enough to do a master's at Central St Martin's, and my studio leader, the tutor of the studio, played an interesting role there. And also, I went on an improv comedian course once, where the person who was running that course had a leadership role with people. And there's quite interesting traits that I think comes out. And it's things like creating safe spaces for experimentation and for expression. I think that's quite an interesting trait that kind of gets in the space between empowerment and needing to be empowered. Also playing a role like resolving tensions and issues between people. So, you know, it might be that you've got a group of people who really want to do something, but actually there's like little tensions or issues between them. So some of the leadership work can actually be kind of almost sitting in the background, out of the way, but creating that space for people to do their best. And for me, that's a really powerful leadership model. And of course, what that means is that leader doesn't necessarily get recognized, but the people who are doing the great stuff get recognized. So there's an ego point there as well.
It's fascinating, isn't it? We definitely see that in business as well. I think, you know, it's certainly in my early years of the transformation at Grid over the last 15 years, we spent basically a lot of time putting retired male white engineers back into boxes and calming them down and showing them what could be done. And I think that, you know, there's certain of that on many political issues around the world, but actually an awful lot of what is being solved by the next generation of engineers coming through, the under 35s, who now make up a huge proportion of the technical people that we've got in National Grid. And it's creating that space for them to then decide and choose how the business moves forward is absolutely vital. Charlie, we've not come to you on this point yet, but how do you see this, you know, the power out of the youth movement, the different ideas coming through? How do we best make sure that there's a really strong interaction between that and policymakers.
I mean, there's some really interesting points that have been raised, and I think I'd kind of pick up a little bit on this idea that leadership is a sort of one of those terms that can mean various things. There's extraordinary advocacy, extraordinary kind of platform that a lot of civil society leaders have, but they don't actually have a lot of levers. And I think there is a slight danger if you talk too much about leadership and too much about empowering. You're almost putting the problem back onto some of those communities who are trying to raise it to be solved. And I think there's we have to continually remind ourselves that at the moment the big levers to solve climate change sit with political leaders at a country level, with investors, with corporate leaders making sensible but ultimately brave decisions to make rapid changes to their business. Most of the action that we need to deliver in the next decade is not going to be delivered by young people on the street. It's going to be delivered by policymakers, politicians. So I think we first of all just need to be really clear that when we talk about leadership, we're not necessarily talking about over to you guys, solve the problem. And then we can talk about how do we make sure that those people feel the agency that they have and can really use the agency that they have. And I think leadership within civil society is about emboldening communities to really flex what agency they do have, and that may be simply at the ballot box, and it may be the honest thing to say to communities is that what you can do about climate change is you can go and vote along climate interested lines. It is that there are fantastic community energy projects and initiatives that they can get involved in, but we have to kind of check this notion of leadership against the agency that different groups and different voices really have, and accept that some leaders are there, as Stephen said, like theatre directors or impresarios creating platforms for messages. They aren't there to screw solar panels into the ground or rewire national energy systems or help communities build flood protection. We have a brilliant civil society and youth roundtable, which is co-chaired by 2 youth activists with the COP president. But we don't leave those meetings with a whole series of actions on the youth members of that committee to go away and solve climate change. We leave those meetings with a whole series of actions for Alok Sharma to go and help solve climate change. And I think that that kind of illustrates this point really well. So I mean, I'm really intrigued, Duncan, by National Grid's leadership in this space. Obviously, a home for lots of the kind of technical solutions, but also a player in the wider political economy. How do you see corporate leadership in this space, where there's obviously a huge number of companies now kind of leaping onto net zero targets and a kind of wider sense of being on the right side of history? But what does that mean in practice, and what sort of leadership are you showing to wider civil society beyond the things that National Grid can deliver themselves as a business?
Yeah, that's a good question, Charlie. We spent a lot of time, it's quite a technical organisation, trying to provide perfect logical answers to people before we realised that wasn't actually the most helpful thing we could do. We had to do that in the background, but a lot of what we're doing at the moment is really around trying to show people what is happening and build confidence that this transition can happen through things such as better and open data on how the grid is being run at the moment, really clear messaging that we're very comfortable around the technical steps to get to net zero, and that it's not scary, it's not going to be brutally expensive, it's not going to lead to massive power cuts, that we can do it reliably, securely, and economically. And the big learning point for us was the first day that the UK ran without coal, which we were really interested in the control centre at the time when I was running it, and we thought might be a small media story. And 24 hours later, after having tweeted it out at 8 o'clock in the morning that it was going to happen, and we'd had 500 million views on different news stories around the world, and it had been the biggest media event in Grid's history, we realised that we could show leadership by being the change, by showing that change, and that a sort of conservative, reserved, organisation like National Grid that people understood would be quite conservative about what it said, was prepared to go, yeah, no, it's fine, we can run a net zero energy system, no problem at all. That in itself was important, that we just said those simple messages. And part of our COP partnership now is basically me walking around the world with a wide team of technical experts going, no, it'll be fine. You can do this, guys, whether that's in Indonesia or in Brazil or South Africa, not in a patronizing way, not in a smug way, but it was easy and hard in the UK for these reasons. You'll have different drivers, but but you can do it. And that sort of being the change leadership has been really important. And understanding how to feed that through organisations has been really key too. On that note, I'm going to turn Sonia to you for a few minutes of questions from the chat, if we've got any.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. So just considering future leaders, if you could see any sort of changes in curricula, in syllabi, in schools to make sure that young people are equipped with knowledge and skills to lead against the climate crisis, what would you like to see?
Does anyone fancy answering that? Mya-Rose, might come to you.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
What should we be teaching in schools?
What should we be teaching in schools? Yeah, I find this a very interesting question just because I literally left school last summer, or I was supposed to. And I think the way that I was taught climate change in school, especially pre the new syllabus, was very strange, where it wasn't really taught as the single reality of what we're experiencing right now. It was a theory amongst a few others as to why the planet might be getting hotter, which was only like 5 or 6 years ago, and that seems bizarre now, and I hope that's not happening anymore. But I think in general I think it's within the climate bubble, it's easy to forget sorry, this is very badly phrased, how much of a lack of information there is for a lot of people, or a lack of understanding about what climate change actually is, what it actually means. I think within the UK in particular, whenever you talk to some people about climate change, it's always like, oh, that means the summer's going to be hotter, that'll be lovely, kind of thing, and a lack of, it isn't climate change. I think lots of people have started calling it climate breakdown to try and help people understand what that means. So I think just in general, I personally just completely didn't experience a proper education about climate change, which seems bizarre now. But I think a lot of that isn't going to come from schools. And I think that's something you sort of have to acknowledge, especially when so many of the things that have created climate change are linked to consumerism, capitalism, corporate greed, government inaction, things like that, where it's just not going to be taught in a syllabus that is government mandated. And so I think projects that are going to be really, really important are ones that are all about education, but maybe external to all of that. Live in Bristol, and there's this amazing sustainability project that's all about teaching about the sustainability goals to kids in primary school and secondary school. And so I think there has to be a concerted effort to properly teach people about these issues, how to combat them, what we need from our leaders, what it actually means for us going forward for young people. And I think there's a complete lack of that at the moment.
That sounds like wholesale revision of the syllabus to me, Mya-Rose. Sonia, another quick one before we move to summaries. Anything else on the chat?
Yeah, just is there a difference between leadership for individual behavior change and systems change, and what does that look like?
Stephen, I feel like you might have an answer on systems change. You want to versus individuals?
It's such a difficult one, this, isn't it? And I think I reflect on this a lot, and I don't necessarily know an answer here. I guess what it comes down to is that systems are groups, collections of individuals acting. So I think you need individual action, and you need this sense that the personal is political when it comes to climate change. And I'm really heartened by what Charlie said earlier as well. There shouldn't be just some expectation that this will be solved by individuals. There is a systems element to it. I think one of the things that, again, sort of going back to the visualising element, and someone's just watching what William's doing in the corner there as well. Actually, sometimes I think visualising a system can be helpful. Actually trying to map what a system looks like, and then that can help us orientate where we might be in that system. I'm sort of developing a lot of systems maps on various projects at the moment, and they often are quite confusing. So it's always like it's actual a visual communication problem to actually communicate a complex system in a way, but it's better than not doing it, and it's better than us all kind of talking and having our own ideas in our own heads, but not really it being different. And putting that down in one place, I think, can actually help.
Can really help. And I'm going to go to all of you, but Stephen, I'll start with you. Just in one sentence, what would you say good leadership really looks like for a fair climate future?
Building on that last point, actually, I think being comfortable with ambiguity. And something that's come up a few times in the chat is about how there's a typical model of leadership as, you know, the strong, often male leader who knows where they're going, even if it's wrong. And I think it's much better to just to be comfortable with the fact that we are in a time where things are complicated, technical, emotional, and to live with that and to sit with that, and then to understand what we need to do moving forward.
Afsheen, does that chime with you? What would your sentence be?
Well, I think I'm thinking about investment, and I'm thinking about thinking about impact, like, having a vision, knowing exactly what outcome you want to see at the end, but being flexible in how you get there. So a bit of agility, flexibility, but a real firm, strong commitment of that outcome, how that you want to get there, but it might look different at different times depending on how things respond and move things around. Does that make sense?
Brilliant. Focusing on that outcome. It does make sense. Focusing on that outcome, which is, I'm sure, something Charlie's doing. But Charlie, how would you wrap that up in a sentence?
What would strong climate leadership look like? I mean, I think strong climate leadership looks like Mya-Rose, actually. Your inquiry, skepticism of the answers, keeping tenaciously pushing on, building the organizations around you that you need to succeed, putting blame and responsibility where it sits, and not giving up.
Brilliant. Well then, Mya-Rose, how do you follow that? We'll finish on you as the example of leadership.
I think in terms of, going for the big picture again, in terms of world leaders, I think that good climate leadership is action. I think as a young person, the endless conversations and meetings about climate change are so frustrating, and an issue that I know could have been solved before I was even born. And so I don't really want conversations anymore, and I'm feeling very cynical about COP26. What I want is for our governments and our world leaders to be leading by example and to be taking these big steps needed to solve or work towards solving and dealing with the side effects of climate change.
Perfect. Right back to the beginning, to action and hard action. And having called us all to account, I would just say thank you to all four of you for being fantastic. At this stage of the process, I'm going to pass back over to Alice, who's going to provide a bit of a summary of the session today. Alice, there you are, brilliant on my screen. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you all for such a fantastic discussion today. We've covered so much today, looking at different types of leadership, examples of actions that have been taken for positive change, and areas that we want to see future leadership in. And I think William's illustration really captures kind of the breadth of the topics that we've been discussing today. In the first section of today's event, we heard from the panel and also from video contributors, both about kind of leading positive change and examples of leadership that we've seen. And that panel spoke about how leadership in its different forms has led to climate change coming more into the public domain and no longer being seen as a niche issue. And some of the examples discussed include youth voices accelerating momentum in the climate movement, and young people coming together to create a platform for change and really inspiring other people to take their own actions and lead change. And we can see this in William's illustration on youth leadership in the top left-hand corner there. We heard about local leaders taking action on net zero for their local communities, and crucially working in partnership and collaboration with local authorities and with communities, bringing different groups on board and communities really driving the agenda. We heard about artists using different media to connect people emotionally with climate change issues. We heard about businesses embedding public value in their work. And lastly, we heard about inclusive models of engagement reaching diverse communities and voices by recruiting local champions who really know local communities and are able to push agendas forward, making sure no one is left behind. The panel and video contributors also shared some of the areas that they would like to see leadership and action in today, including seeing leadership from world leaders. And we've seen this in William's illustration of more action, less talk. And we heard about the need to burst climate bubbles and ensure that climate movements are becoming more diverse, and that understanding that climate change is impacting people today and impacting some people more than others. We heard that art can play an important role in bringing issues to life and bringing attention to the emotional components of decision making. And lastly, that leadership and actions need to be collaborative, involving communities, involving key stakeholders to ensure that everybody benefits equally from the changes that are being led. And then in the second section, we discussed leadership skills. Panelists highlighted that there are many different forms of leadership, and actually leadership might be changing. Our understanding of what leadership looks like might be changing. We heard that compassion, empathy, and trust is really important for leadership, as well as a nurturing role, empowering each other to be leaders and creating safe spaces so that we can move forward together with a shared vision. And Williams highlighted this through his "Everyone with us on a journey" image in his illustration. Also, Williams' image of find a cause and not just the leader, I think is important, about empowering people to engage with the issues and having a cause to rally around is really important. And this kind of come back to good leadership being all about building partnerships through collaboration. From businesses, we heard that business leaders themselves need to lead by example and develop skills to support society in ways that address inequality, and that leadership can be taking advantage of moments for change and using those moments of change as a catalyst. And then finally, we heard that leadership needs to be about action. It needs to be about putting delivery plans into practice. So I'd really like to thank our panel and our video contributors today for such an interesting and engaging discussion. This was the final event in our Together for a Fair Climate Future series. And if you'd like to catch up on any of the 5 previous events in this series, they're all saved on our website, which will be linked in the YouTube chat. We'll be pulling together some of the themes and recommendations from across the series to produce a virtual book, which we will be taking to COP26 later this year. So thank you to the speakers from across the series for their expertise, recommendations for a fair climate future. And then finally, at Sustainability First, we have a number of other activities happening at the moment that you might like to get involved in. If you're based in London, we are running an art exhibition in Bermondsey, which is on now until the 10th of July. And this exhibition is all about making connections to each other, to nature and to technology during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also launched our 2021 Art and Writing Prize, also on the theme of Together for a Fair Climate Future. So please do apply and share your creative visions. The deadline is the 10th of July. And finally, we have also published a set of educational workshop materials on climate change and sustainable living. So please do look those online resources up on our website. So thank you again to our fantastic panel and video contributors for today's discussion. Thank you to Duncan for chairing and to National Grid for sponsoring the series. I'd also like to thank William for illustrating and capturing today's discussion, and also the Sustainability First team for putting today's event together. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great afternoon.